Holmes is as famous in Tokyo as he is in Timbuktu.
Who is the real Sherlock Holmes?
Why is he so famous?
It's a question that transcends the pages of Arthur Conan Doyle's books.
Mr. Holmes? Hello.
Eccentric weird genius played by Downey.
Right you are.
Or the socially awkward Cumberbatch.
Who are you?
Sherlock Holmes.
Sherlock Holmes, a paper creation born out of a writer's brilliant imagination.
Who's more similar to what Arthur Conan Doyle had in mind when he wrote this brilliant character who solved riddles for breakfast on
221B Baker Street?
It is Holmes, Sherlock Holmes. It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Many have stepped into the shoes of the great detective, from Basil Rathbone to Jeremy Brett, each leaving an indelible mark. But what if I told you these were just the tip of the iceberg? Could there be more to Sherlock Holmes than meets the eye? What if I told you that this beloved detective might have deeper roots in history than you ever imagined? This is where the line between fiction and reality blurs. This is where we go back in time to when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a mere medical student and met a man who single-handedly changed the trajectory of his life.
I refer, of course, to the master detective of 221B Baker Street, Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
This man would inspire Doyle to pen down one of the most iconic characters of all time.
Thinking superhero.
More intelligent than anyone who's ever lived.
The name's Sherlock Holmes and the address is 221B Baker Street.
Sherlock Holmes' inspiration ranges from literature to film.
260 films to date, 1,000 television episodes, and just as many imitations.
Theatre to video games.
Not to mention the video games, comic books.
And even the minds of the great detectives who followed in his footsteps.
Adapted more frequently than Dracula, Frankenstein, Napoleon, or Jesus Christ.
At one point, it made Conan Doyle more well-known than the Queen herself.
Game, Mrs. Hudson, is on.
Tired of Holmes, when he killed the character, 20,000 Strand readers cancelled their subscription, wrote threat letters to Doyle himself, and people across the globe started Keep Holmes Alive Club.
He died once, but the outcry over his passing was so enormous that he had no choice but to come back to life.
Not dead.
And what now? If I told you all this mania was for a character based on a medical professor, Joseph Bell.
And prepare yourself. He's a real performer.
Joseph Bell was a man of formidable character and razor-sharp deduction skill.
Mr. Doyle, good morning again.
A Scottish surgeon and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh's Medical School, he was also a driving force in the creation of forensic science. He's hailed from a family history of doctors, his great-grandfather being Dr. Benjamin Bell himself, who was the first Scottish scientific surgeon. He was also among the first to promote hygiene during surgical procedures.
Hygiene is of little use if the man dies on us here.
But what separated him from the rest is his deduction skill, which he called his method.
You believe my method has no practical use?
Dr. Bell could deduce whether a patient was a sailor or soldier by his gait, detect from his dialect precisely where he hailed from, and reveal his occupation from observing the position of calluses on his hands. His method was simply a process of deduction based on careful observation of small details about a patient.
Every tiny detail, every button, every line, every gesture, every hair, every speck is of use and value to us.
He could tell a person's name by observing the laundry label, know about the smoking habit of the patient by the ulcer in the lips, and several other by small-minute details which only his eyes could catch. Very much like Sherlock Holmes.
You see, but you do not observe.
And like Sherlock Holmes, he was consulted by the police force, Scotland Yard, even by the Crown itself, when his assistance was required. Most famous among them would be the Ripper murders.
His biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper. Back in 1888, the notorious serial killer murdered and mutilated the bodies of 5 women in London.
Jack the Ripper was a name given by media to the serial killer who terrorized the streets at those times by killing prostitutes on East End slum.
Have any meaning to it at all?
No one was even charged, although the police have had their suspicions now.
Police still had their suspects: an English barrister, a Polish Jew, a Russian petty criminal, but no compelling evidence for any of them.
The serial killer was never publicly caught in, but after Joseph Bell was consulted, he examined the facts and even suggested a suspect. And after that, the killings stopped.
So-called Ripper walks now of his murder sites. We play board games where we try and capture him, or more worryingly, help him escape. We read about him in fiction. We're also still attracted to the idea of violence in a perverse way, and the violence was particularly extreme around these cases.
Doyle was somewhat similar to Bell, what Dr. Watson was to Holmes. The physical features of the two men were described as similar, but unlike Holmes, who was brusque and opinionated, Joe had a much gentler nature. Doyle worked as a clerk to Dr. Bell.
I would like you to become my clerk.
And got to know the doctor and his method very well.
Mr. Doyle, using your eyes, your ears, your brain, your bumper perception, what can you deduce from this man's appearance?
Referring to Dr. Bell, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, "It is most certainly to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes, and though in the stories I have the advantage of being able to place him in all sorts of dramatic positions." And to this, Bell simply replied with, "Doyle's the clever man. It's nothing to do with me." Bell considers Doyle to be one of the best students he ever had, with a keen eye for diagnosis. Bell inspired the creation of Holmes, but there was more to it. Holmes also partly inspired from another teacher of Doyle, Dr. Henry Littlejohn. Dr. Henry Littlejohn, who was also a consulting detective and even worked together with Dr. Bell, being each other's Holmes and Watson. Though Doyle didn't publicly acknowledge Littlejohn for many years to come, Doyle did eventually point out Littlejohn as a source as well, mentioning him along with Bell much later in his life. Dr. Bell's legacy lives on in Sherlock Holmes' adaptation that will continue with time.
From the astrologer came the astronomer. From the alchemist came the chemist. From the mesmerist came the mental specialist. The charlatan is always the pioneer. The quack of yesterday is the professor of tomorrow.
Once, when he was asked what he makes Sherlock being adapted, he said something along the lines of, "They make many a fellow who has before felt very little interest in his life and daily surroundings think that, after all, there may be much more in life if he only keeps his eyes open than he had ever dreamed of in his philosophy."